The first thing Detective Marcus noticed on his very first week in the neighborhood wasn't the quiet charm of the old country houses or the friendly smiles of the mailman. It was the sight of a perfectly polished SUV creeping into his driveway, and the woman behind the wheel, smug as though she owned the world. Her name was Karen, and she didn't even glance around as she leaned out, snatched the Amazon package Marcus had been waiting for, tucked it neatly into the seat beside her, and drove away like she was completing an errand on her own property. Marcus stood frozen at his window, coffee cup midair, his eyes narrowing. Why would anyone so brazenly steal a package in broad daylight, especially when every door on the block had cameras pointing outward? That single image, her manicured hand gripping his package with arrogant ease, was burned into his mind, and he knew right then this wasn't going to be a peaceful neighborhood for long. The next morning, the HOA newsletter landed on his porch, and he learned who she was. Karen Thompson, HOA president. Her picture sat at the top of the page, smiling, blonde curls lacquered into place, a tone of authority bleeding from every printed word. Rules about lawn height, where to park, what color mailbox was approved, and even which kind of curtains one could hang indoors. Marcus chuckled, but the chuckle didn't last. The memory of her smug theft lingered. She was not just a stickler for rules. She was the type to bend them for herself while tightening them around everyone else's neck. It started small. A neighbor, Mrs. Green, whispered to Marcus over her fence that her granddaughter's bicycle had gone missing. "It's always Karen," she said in a low tone. "She says she's protecting the community, but half the missing things end up in her garage for months." Marcus kept quiet, but suspicion grew. He replayed the footage from his doorbell cam. Karen's SUV, her confident stride, her total lack of hesitation. This wasn't petty theft. This was entitlement elevated into an art form. By the third week, Marcus wasn't just a neighbor adjusting to rural life. He was a cop piecing together a puzzle. And then came the day that turned suspicion into conflict. He found her SUV again, but this time not in his driveway. It was parked half inside his barn, the wooden doors forced open like an unwelcome guest. She sat behind the wheel, engine off, eyes glued to her phone as though she had every right in the world to be there. He approached slowly, his boots crunching over gravel, and cleared his throat. Karen didn't even look startled. Instead, she rolled down the window, gave him a tight smile, and said, "Oh good, you're here. I need this space for a while. The HOA rules are very clear about keeping streets uncluttered, and my driveway's being resealed." Marcus didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked past her to the cows in the barn. Gentle but territorial creatures, already snorting at the scent of the stranger's car. The situation was absurd, yet tense. She wasn't just trespassing. She was daring him to challenge her authority. That was when Karen leaned forward, her tone dripping with arrogance. "As HOA president, I can approve temporary parking arrangements. Don't worry, I'll keep an eye on your animals while I'm here." The irony was unbearable. Marcus was a man who had investigated cartel smugglers, tracked down fugitives across state lines, and testified in federal courts. Yet here he was, being lectured about rules by a woman parking in his barn as if it belonged to her. He stepped closer, calm but firm, and told her to leave. She smirked, tossed her curls, and refused. And in that stubborn moment, the cows, agitated by her car's presence, began shifting restlessly. Their massive bodies pushed against the SUV from behind, testing its balance on the uneven barn floorboards. Karen was too busy ranting about neighborhood standards to notice, but Marcus did. He folded his arms, watching as the inevitable began. The SUV rocked once, then twice, as one of the larger cows pressed its weight against the rear bumper. Karen shrieked, fumbling for the ignition, but it was too late. The barn echoed with a groan of wood and metal as the vehicle tilted dangerously to the side. Marcus didn't move. He simply observed, his mind racing not just with amusement, but with clarity. This wasn't just a ridiculous stunt gone wrong. This was evidence, another piece in the growing case against her, another example of how her arrogance would lead to her downfall. But Marcus also knew something bigger was unraveling here. Karen's intrusion wasn't just about a stolen package or an SUV where it didn't belong. She was weaving herself into every corner of this neighborhood, hiding behind the shield of HOA rules, intimidating others into silence. And now, He had both motive and means to expose her. The real question wasn't whether Karen would be stopped. It was how spectacularly she would collapse once the truth came to light. And as the cows shoved harder, and her screams mixed with the groaning of metal, Marcus allowed himself the faintest smile. This was only the beginning. Karen's shrill protests still rang in Marcus's ears long after she finally managed to yank her SUV out of the barn, tires spinning furiously against the gravel, leaving behind deep ruts as though she had tried to claw her way free from justice itself. She had sped off without so much as a glance back, but Marcus had caught every detail. The dented bumper where the cows had pressed their weight, the scratches along the side where barn beams had scraped, the look of pure panic that broke through her arrogance for the first time. That fleeting glimpse was enough to convince Marcus that beneath her polished image and loud authority lay someone desperate to maintain control. He didn't confront her further that day. Instead, he went back inside, poured himself a coffee, and began pulling files. His instincts as a detective wouldn't allow him to treat this as just another strange neighborly spat. Something about Karen's entitlement didn't stop at property lines. It spread like rot, infecting everything around her. Over the next week, Marcus began quietly observing, gathering details the way he always did during an investigation. Packages were reported missing by 2 more neighbors, each one brushing it off as delivery error. A set of tools vanished from Mr. Jenkins' shed, only for him to later receive a citation from the HOA for unsafe storage of property. Marcus saw the pattern immediately. Karen wasn't just stealing. She was repackaging her thefts as neighborhood violations, twisting the rules to both cover her tracks and punish those she victimized. With his background in law enforcement, Marcus knew the psychology. Karen fed on control. She wanted to be seen as the enforcer, the gatekeeper, the guardian of a community that had never actually asked for her protection. He began pulling footage, not just from his own camera, but from anyone willing to share. A few neighbors hesitated, afraid of retaliation, but when Marcus quietly revealed he was with the police, trust grew. Soon, he had clips from 3 different homes. Karen slipping packages into her trunk under the guise of delivering them safely. Karen walking away with a bicycle under her arm while glancing around smugly. Karen herself issuing violation slips taped neatly onto doors the same day the stolen items disappeared. The evidence mounted like bricks in a wall, each one making the case against her stronger. Still, Marcus knew that timing mattered. Exposing her too early would only give her a chance to manipulate the narrative, to paint herself as a victim of harassment. He needed to wait until her own arrogance led her into an undeniable trap. But Karen wasn't sitting idle. The incident at the barn seemed to ignite her temper rather than humble her. Marcus noticed her SUV circling his property at odd hours, headlights sweeping across his front windows, engine purring low like a predator waiting to strike. One evening, his mailbox was pried open and left dangling on its hinges, a citation arriving the next day for improperly secured mail receptacles. It was almost laughable, but the danger was real. She wasn't afraid of him. She was testing him, probing for weakness, daring him to make a wrong move. The community watched nervously from behind curtains, whispering about the detective who had moved in next door to the HOA queen, wondering how long it would be before sparks turned to fire. The breaking point came during a Saturday neighborhood inspection that Karen herself organized. She strutted down the street in her bright floral dress, clipboard in hand, barking at children to put away chalk drawings and lecturing an elderly man about the unauthorized shade of his patio umbrella. When she reached Marcus's property, she didn't hesitate. She marched up his driveway, eyes scanning every detail like a hawk. Then, with theatrical flourish, she began jotting down notes: grass length, a fence post slightly crooked, and finally the barn itself. Marcus stood by silently, watching as she declared his barn non-compliant with structural integrity guidelines. The hypocrisy was unbearable. She had forced her SUV inside that same barn, scraping its beams, yet now she condemned it as unsafe. Marcus kept his face neutral, but his plan solidified in that moment. If Karen wanted to wield HOA rules like weapons, then he would use her own actions as the evidence that buried her. Later that night, he pieced together the footage of her car inside his barn, layered with recordings of her issuing citations. It painted a perfect picture of her duplicity, an authority figure breaking the very rules she enforced. Still, Marcus held back. He wanted more. He wanted the final strike to be so damning, so public, that even her closest allies on the board would abandon her. That opportunity arrived sooner than expected. 2 days later, Marcus received a call from Mrs. Green again. Her granddaughter's bicycle, which had disappeared weeks earlier, had been spotted in Karen's garage when the door accidentally rolled up during a storm. Marcus's pulse quickened. He knew that if stolen property could be recovered directly from Karen's home, the matter would move beyond petty neighborhood squabbles. It would become a criminal case. But he also knew Karen wouldn't give up easily. She had spent years building her power here, weaving fear and control into the fabric of the community. To take her down, Marcus had to be ready for the full storm she would unleash when cornered. And as he drove past her house that night, headlights catching the faint glint of a child's bicycle leaning against her garage wall, he realized something chilling. Karen wasn't careless. She had left it visible on purpose, like bait in a trap. She wanted him to notice. She wanted him to make a move. And Marcus, tightening his grip on the steering wheel, understood exactly what kind of game he had stepped into. This was no longer about a stolen package. This was a war, and Karen intended to fight it on her terms. The neighborhood buzzed with unease in the days that followed, a tension so thick Marcus could feel it every time he stepped outside. Karen's presence loomed over the community like a storm cloud, her SUV parked conspicuously in different driveways as if to remind everyone that she had eyes everywhere. People waved to Marcus politely, but their glances carried something more: hope, as though they expected him to be the one to finally pull the thorn from their side. Marcus had lived through high-stakes manhunts and sting operations, but the quiet, oppressive fear Karen had managed to cultivate in this suburban corner was unlike anything he had seen. It wasn't violence that kept people in line. It was her ability to twist the smallest rule, the most innocent slip, into humiliation and punishment. And now, with evidence piling up on his desk, Marcus knew her empire of intimidation was one step away from collapsing. His first move was subtle. He filed an anonymous request for the HOA's financial records, knowing full well that Karen, as president, controlled much of the paperwork. When the documents finally arrived, they were riddled with irregularities, inflated maintenance fees, miscellaneous expenses that seemed to cover her personal landscaping and spa visits, even a line item that read security patrol vehicle, clearly referring to her shiny SUV. It was the pattern of a woman who believed the rules were nothing more than a shield to hide behind while she siphoned off whatever she pleased. Marcus documented everything carefully, cross-referencing HOA bylaws and photographing every incriminating page. The deeper he dug, the clearer it became. Karen wasn't just a petty thief. She was orchestrating a systematic abuse of power under the guise of neighborhood order. Still, Marcus knew that paper trails and hidden footage weren't enough to topple someone like her. Karen's greatest weapon was her grip on perception. She could stand in front of a crowd, spin a story, and turn herself from a thief into a martyr if given the chance. That was why he needed to stage her downfall not in secrecy, but in broad daylight, where every lie would crumble under the weight of undeniable truth. The opportunity presented itself at the monthly HOA meeting, an event Karen ran with all the pomp of a courtroom, gavel and all. Marcus decided it was time. The night of the meeting, neighbors filed into the community hall, their chatter low and uneasy. Karen stood at the front in her tailored blazer, clipboard in hand, her smile stretched tight but confident. She launched into her usual monologue about keeping lawns trimmed and fences uniform, her voice ringing with false authority. But Marcus noticed something. Her hands trembled ever so slightly when she shuffled her papers. For all her bravado, she knew the walls were closing in. When it came time for community questions, Marcus rose slowly from his seat. The room quieted. He could feel every eye turning toward him, waiting. With calm precision, he laid out his findings, beginning with the footage of her SUV in his barn. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Then he displayed clips of her taking packages and bicycles, each one followed by the matching HOA citation she had issued to the victims. Finally, he revealed the financial discrepancies, the siphoned funds, the so-called security vehicle everyone now recognized. Karen's face flushed crimson, her lips curling into a snarl as she tried to shout him down. She called him a liar, accused him of fabricating evidence, claimed this was nothing but a vendetta from a bitter newcomer. But Marcus had prepared for that too. With one final stroke, he revealed his badge, his voice steady as he announced who he was, not just a neighbor, but a detective. The room erupted. Neighbors who had once kept silent began shouting their own grievances, stories of missing tools, unfair fines, and Karen's manipulations. It was as though a dam had broken, years of fear spilling into a flood of anger. Cornered, Karen attempted her last defense. She stormed toward Marcus, waving her clipboard like a weapon, declaring that as HOA president, she had the right to remove him from the community entirely. But before she could spew another threat, the double doors opened, and two officers from Internal Affairs stepped inside, summoned by Marcus's quiet report earlier that week. Their presence froze the room. Karen's voice cracked as she stammered excuses, but the officers moved with calm authority, requesting she step outside for questioning. Her composure crumbled, her carefully styled hair falling loose as sweat glistened on her forehead. She tried to retreat, but the crowd blocked her path. Neighbors she had once silenced now stood shoulder to shoulder, watching with grim satisfaction as the very rules she had twisted were finally being turned against her. As she was escorted out, Karen hurled wild accusations, claims that Marcus had framed her, that the community had conspired against her, that none of this would stand in court. But Marcus didn't flinch. He had seen this desperation before, the flailing of someone who had lived too long in the illusion of control. And though the night ended with Karen driven away in a police car, Marcus knew this was not yet the end. People like her didn't surrender quietly. She would scheme, claw, and attempt to twist the narrative again. The trial ahead would be ugly, and her arrogance might still find ways to poison the neighborhood. Yet for the first time, the balance had shifted. The community no longer looked at her with fear. They looked at Marcus with trust. And deep in his gut, Marcus understood that while this battle had been won, the war with Karen was far from over. The days after Karen's arrest were filled with murmurs and speculation, the neighborhood caught between relief and uncertainty. For years she had been the immovable force, dictating every detail of their lives, and now she was gone, swept away in a whirlwind of flashing lights and police reports. Yet Marcus knew better than to consider it finished. Karen was cunning, and her arrogance had been forged through years of getting away with everything. He expected pushback, appeals, and desperate attempts to claw back her influence. And sure enough, within a week, she was out on bail, her return announced by the sudden reappearance of her SUV parked defiantly on her driveway like a conquering banner. But something had changed. The fear she once commanded was gone. Curtains still twitched when she drove past, but now there was no submission in those eyes, only simmering anger and defiance. The very people she had controlled were no longer willing to bow. Marcus prepared for what he knew would come, her attempt at one final spectacle to reclaim her power. It arrived in the form of a hastily organized community safety demonstration, an event she promoted with posters and emails declaring that she was cleared of all false accusations and would be restoring order to the neighborhood. Against his better judgment, Marcus attended, knowing the best way to end this was to confront her lies in the open. The gathering was held near the old barn on his property, of all places, as though Karen had deliberately chosen it to mock him. She arrived dressed in her signature pastel blazer, heels clicking against the gravel, her voice booming through a portable speaker as she announced new rules, tighter inspections, and harsher fines. It was a desperate attempt to reassert control, but the crowd remained unmoved. Their silence was not agreement. It was the quiet before collapse. Then came the twist no one expected. In her rush to dramatize her authority, Karen parked her SUV inside Marcus's barn again, announcing it was a demonstration of proper community storage practices. The crowd groaned at the absurdity, but Marcus said nothing. He simply stood back, arms folded, watching. The cows had been uneasy since the commotion began, their heavy bodies shifting restlessly inside the barn. When Karen revved the engine to punctuate her speech, the sound and fumes sent the animals into a frenzy. One massive cow pushed against the SUV, then another joined, their combined force rocking the vehicle violently. Karen shrieked from inside, clawing at the wheel as the crowd gasped. But no one moved to help. They had all suffered too long under her reign, and now they stood rooted, transfixed by the spectacle of poetic justice unfolding before them. The SUV tilted dangerously, tires lifting off the uneven floorboards, and with a final shove from the cows, it toppled onto its side with a thunderous crash. Karen tumbled out through the open door, covered in dust and hay, her pastel blazer torn, her hair matted and wild. The clipboard she had carried everywhere snapped in two under her weight, scattering useless papers into the dirt. For the first time, she was stripped of her armor. No rules, no authority, no mask of control. Just a woman exposed in front of the very people she had ruled over. The crowd erupted, not in laughter, but in a release of years of pent-up frustration, their shouts echoing like thunder. Phones rose into the air, recording every moment, ensuring there would be no rewriting of this humiliation. Police arrived shortly after, summoned by Marcus's quiet call as soon as the chaos began. They found her flailing and screaming about conspiracies, accusing Marcus of staging the entire event with trained attack cows. The officers barely concealed their disbelief as they handcuffed her once again, this time under the weight of far more charges: fraud, theft, embezzlement, and now public endangerment. She was loaded into the cruiser as neighbors cheered, her shrieks fading into the distance. Unlike before, there would be no easy bail. The evidence Marcus had compiled, combined with the flood of testimony from liberated neighbors, was overwhelming. Karen's reign was not just weakened, it was shattered. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood transformed. Mailboxes repaired, chalk drawings bloomed on sidewalks without fear, children rode bicycles freely once again. The barn was fixed up, its doors reinforced, standing as a silent reminder of the day the community reclaimed itself. Marcus, once just the new neighbor with a quiet smile, became a figure of respect, the man who had stared down the tyrant and ended her grasp. Yet he never bragged, never claimed victory aloud. He knew justice wasn't about pride. It was about balance being restored, about people being able to live without fear. And though Karen's name still floated in hushed conversations, it was no longer with dread, but with disbelief. How one woman had thought she could control everything, only to be undone by the very rules she twisted and the cows she underestimated. In the end, it wasn't Marcus's badge alone that brought her down. It was the community's refusal to remain silent any longer, the truth breaking free, and the simple, undeniable weight of justice, delivered, fittingly, by the heaviest creatures in the barn. For Marcus, the case was closed, but the lesson lingered. Arrogance may build walls, but eventually, they collapse. And when they do, the fall is never quiet. It crashes loudly, like an SUV tipped over by cows, leaving behind a silence that feels, at last, like peace.